welcome to this week's podcast or YouTube, subject to how you're watching or listening. I have a fantastic guest for you today. As you know, for those of you that listened or watched our content previously, we do have a little speckle of guests sometimes, and we tend to pick our guests on the basis of insight that our audience would like to listen to or watch. And I'm really excited about today's guest. I'm going to intro him in a second in terms of what he's going to talk about. But if there's one report that you probably look out for every single year, if you work in digital marketing, whether you're a digital marketeer or whether you just work within the industry and it's your job to do marketing, you probably read the We Are Social Hootsuite Digital social media report that comes out Jan-Feb every year. Well, I'm delighted to say that Simon Kemp from Kepios, who actually creates the report, is actually here with me today. So it's great to have you, Simon, and I'm super excited that we're going to be bringing some of the insight today from your fantastic insights.
Thanks for having me, Lynsey. Great to be here.
So if any of you have listened or watched our insights before as well, you will know that we probably often say data and insights is great, but context is key. Now, data is just numbers if you don't have insight behind it. So I've worked with Simon to create some questions that we think probably, well, I know people ask me on a regular basis, and at Social Beat, we often think about these questions as well. So Simon is very passionate. The report is about 300 pages now, and Simon and I could spend all month talking about it because we're both very passionate about data and context. But sadly, Simon is very busy and we don't have that much time. So hopefully over the next 30 to 40 to 50 minutes, we're going to be covering some core questions. But that said, if you have any questions or insights after today, please do reach out to us at info@socialbee.co.uk. So Simon, how long has the report been going before we start on sort of the more intricate questions?
This is its 10th year, so it will actually be the 10th anniversary next week of the very first one of these that I produced, which is going to be a slightly nerdy milestone that I'll be celebrating in some way. But yeah, we sort of started off very, very small. We did a couple of countries back in the very first section, and then it expanded now to 240 countries around the world. So it's not only has it been going for 10 years, it's also now encompassing a large number of additional countries as well. So its remit has grown, shall we say.
Yeah, and it isn't just social now, it's digital as well. And then you've got the whole COVID overlap that's obviously been incorporated as well, hasn't it? Which is interesting in itself.
Yeah, so the report covers internet behaviors, social media use, mobile, in particular mobile apps, e-commerce, and a little bit of digital advertising in there as well. We tend to focus on consumer behaviors. So this is much more a report that looks at what people are doing rather than what companies are doing. But inevitably within that, we've got a little bit of the company data too. But yeah, every year it slightly grows and expands in terms of what's included. And last year we had a great set of data, especially from our partners at GWI, to help us look at what's happening as a result of COVID. So I get the feeling we'll touch on some of those insights today, but yeah, it's been really interesting to see how things have changed over the past year.
Yeah, I bet it'd be really fascinating to dig out like year one report and this year's report and see how much things have changed, and especially from a consumer point of view, because again, listeners to us will always know that we're always going, wear the consumer shoes, wear the customer shoes. It doesn't matter what company you are. It's not about you, it's about the consumers. And I think that's where this report can be really, really powerful.
It challenges a lot of the sort of the misconceptions and the stereotypes that we tend to have as marketers. And I think, you know, every year I look at the data and I'm surprised. There was a whole bunch of things in this year's data that caught me off guard, even though I pride myself on looking at this data all the time. There's still numbers in there that I'll look at them and I'll think, goodness, that's completely different to what I expected. In terms of that growth over the past 10 years, you're right, there's been some startling change in terms of the adoption of all of these different platforms and tools. But I think at the same time, it's not even just in 10 years that those things have changed dramatically. Even in 3 months, we can see some of the numbers changing quite significantly, and that's got some important implications for marketers. So as much as we'll touch on some of the numbers today, we should probably look at what those mean, what those changes mean for marketers especially.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why one of the reasons why we wanted you on here today, because the data is the data, but we're very actionable and we want our clients and listeners to say, okay, well, that's great, but what can I do with that data? Or should I do this? Or should I do that? And that perhaps leads us on to the first question of the random assumptions or the latest platforms, because probably in the last 12 months, most people have played with TikTok, whether they've, you know, got their grandma on there or whether they've just, you know, had a little sneaky look themselves. There's been lots of debate over whether people should be on TikTok. What does the data tell us, Simon?
So TikTok is one of those sneaky platforms that doesn't publish a huge amount of data yet because they're still private and because they've not had a big investment sort of opportunity, if you like an IPO. They're still very careful about what they publish. The exact numbers are difficult to come by. So we published numbers that appeared in a filing that they made with a US government agency back in the sort of middle of last year when they were facing all of those threats of them being banned in the US, but I suspect it's grown considerably since then. So I'm a bit hesitant to give you a number that's up to date today. I would be surprised if it's not somewhere between 800 million and a billion monthly active users already, just based on the growth patterns that we're seeing and just the enthusiasm around the platform. But I think, to your point there about the assumptions that we come in with as marketers, that is a potential reach number. It's not the number that you're going to be able to reach as a marketer. Even on TikTok, which has still got fairly decent organic reach, you're going to struggle to reach a significant proportion of those users. So whenever you're looking at these platforms, especially when you're looking at new platforms where there's excitement around the number of users, try not to get distracted by that. It's a good benchmark of how popular a platform is, but by no means are you going to be able to reach all of those users with your activities.
And I think that's a really good point, Simon, because people often go, oh, we should be on TikTok because it's the latest platform. And I'm like, yes, but actually there's so many solid platforms out there that you've got so much more data, you've got so much insight, your audience is on there. If time is tight, and we've had a lot of organizations reach out to us in the last year that maybe have either furloughed all their marketing teams, sadly made them all redundant. And it could be that someone who doesn't do marketing is suddenly in charge of digital and marketing. You'd be surprised at what, businesses have had to do in the last 12 months. And then they're thinking, should I be on TikTok? And I'm like, no, if your resource is really tight, stick to sort of what you do know. Like you've said, make yourself aware of, what's happening and what platforms there and the excitement around it, but go with what you know as a good solid resource.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, one of the most important things to look at is the cost per desired outcome. I'm going to add another annoying kind of term to the marketing lexicon there, but a lot of the time we look at cost per meal, so the CPMs, the reach metrics, we look at cost per click, we look at these things, but realistically, what you really want to be looking at as a marketer is how much does it cost me to achieve the outcome that I care about for my brand? And that's going to vary quite considerably, even within the same brand from one campaign to the next. So user numbers are interesting. They're a great benchmark to tell you whether a platform is hot right now. But much more important than that, look at the creative opportunities that each of the platforms offer. Look at how much it's going to cost you to then deliver those creative opportunities to your particular audience and how many of them you can reach. Once you've got those basic metrics, which are usually relatively easy to come by, not necessarily something that you'll get immediately, but once you've done a couple of tests, even just a couple of £100, couple of $100 of testing will allow you to see whether a particular platform delivers more or less than the same sort of activity on a different platform. That's what you want to be looking at. So my top advice here is experiment with these things. If you don't know whether you should be on TikTok, the simplest thing you can do is get a fairly simple piece of creative, ideally something that you've already created for a different platform, if that's suitable. Test it, put a couple of quid behind it, see whether that works as a stress test, if you like, of your outcomes. See how it compares against similar platforms like maybe Instagram, Snapchat, all that kind of stuff. And then decide based on that. There's nothing to say that you need a big presence already. You don't need hundreds or even thousands of followers to find out whether these platforms work for you. So if you're worried about it and you're spending a lot of time thinking about it, go in and test it, and that will quickly get you to a much more concrete answer than lying in bed worrying about it.
Yes, yeah, excellent. Okay. And linked to that, what other sort of, we have lots of random assumptions that we make without going into data. Were there any other interesting sort of assumptions that perhaps you thought that you discovered were perhaps wrong or surprisingly different from the report in the last 12 months?
Yeah, so my memory is terrible. I'm going to forget these. So I'll introduce you them up front, and then Lynsey, you can remind me when I forget what they are. So e-commerce demographics was probably one of the standout things for me. Gaming demographics, another big standout for me. And then the role of streaming platforms in our TV habit. So those are the three bits that I want to pull out. There's loads of other great sound bites in the data, but as you said in your intro, we could talk about this for months. So in the interest of people getting to their dinner at some point today, we should probably focus on those three for now. So let's start off with the e-commerce data. I think especially for marketers in Europe, who have suffered unfortunately, the most sort of restrictive of lockdowns during COVID times. A lot of the media coverage that we saw last year around changes in digital behaviors due to COVID talked about the dramatic increase in e-commerce activity, especially amongst older shoppers. What was really interesting, I went into the data, I'll confess, I went into the data looking to tell that story and saying, look how much it's changed. And then to my horror, it hadn't. And the reality is that older audiences already shop online. Even before COVID, they already shopped online almost as much as their children's generation did. So specifically here, looking at GWI data, people aged 55 to 64 already shopped online every month in great numbers. So 72% already shopped online at least once a month prior to COVID. That's increased by a couple of percentage points. So we're looking at maybe 75% of them by Q3 2020 were shopping online, but that's nowhere near the levels of explosive growth that I was expecting to see based on those media results. So in reality, age isn't a big determinant of whether people shop online. It does determine the devices that they use. Older people are much more likely to use a computer compared to younger people and vice versa when it comes to mobile. But I think the fact that people were already shopping online came as quite a big surprise to me. The real change when you start to dig into that data is the kind of categories that people are shopping in. So in particular, this relates to groceries. Unfortunately, I don't have data broken down by age when it comes to that, but just using some proxies, we've been able to see that older people have been spending a lot more time shopping for their food and personal care items online compared to what they would have done previously. We should expect to see that come down slightly once people are able to go back to physical stores. I know this always sounds a bit weird when I say it, but people do enjoy going to the supermarket. It's a pain, but at the same time, I think especially marketers will relate to this. If you go to a new country, there's something really interesting about going and seeing a new shopping environment in a supermarket. There's so much you can absorb and sort of just take out of that experience. So when people can return to stores, they will. But I think we've seen a shift in behaviors that will never go back to what it was before. I'm not going to say all of those things that the media said, that things will never be the same again, but certainly we will incorporate those new behaviors into our ongoing activities as well. So that's one of the big changes. Let me pause there and ask you if you've got anything you want to ask on that before I ramble for the other two.
That's really fascinating, because I would have assumed, and probably much of everyone else would have assumed, my parents included, but ironically, having you now said that, my mum always did purchase online and did click and collects, and she's still doing that, and she was purchasing other stuff actually. But so I look at just my parents in very small isolation compared to everyone else on this planet. Their shopping habits haven't really changed. If anybody, it's me that's changed, because I was the person that went into the shop, and this always surprises people. Like, I work in digital marketing and I never buy online. I hate the experience. I'm a touchy-feely person. I want to go touch it, feel it, have a look around, and it's really forced me to buy online. So I guess I'm not an assumption either, but if I just look at the people around me, it sort of backs up the data that you've shared there. So it is fascinating, and it just again highlights that we shouldn't assume. We should go looking for the data and the insights.
Absolutely. I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. I have these stereotypes in my mind of what I expect people to do. And that's why I love these reports, is that it completely shocks me a lot of the time when you see what the data tells you. It's a good segue to talk about video games. So video games is possibly one of the most stereotyped of activities in the world. It's spotty teenage boys in their basements playing games and their mum shouting at them. That's kind of this view that the media has built of games. And in fact, the data says it's completely not the case at all. Sure enough, younger men are the biggest users of these things, but only by a fraction. And in fact, even 2/3 of baby boomers are playing video games on a regular basis. It blows my mind that it's that level of adoption. If you told me it was 20-30%, I might have gone, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But we're looking at 2/3 of people aged 55 to 64 saying they play video games. The majority of those are on their smartphones. So it's not like they're sitting down with the latest PlayStation and playing, hours and hours on end. But nonetheless, I think it will come as a surprise, I think, to a lot of marketers to learn that on a global basis, that's the sort of level that we're looking at. Now, it does vary from country to country. Interestingly, when you look at the highest rates of adoption, it's actually Southeast Asia. So Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand are the biggest places where people are playing games, Indonesia in particular as well. But having said that, right the way around the world, you will see enthusiasm for playing games, whether it's something like Candy Crush or doing a Sudoku on your smartphone, right the way through to playing things like Call of Duty, stuff like that. So video games, again, was a big surprise to me when I learned about that popularity across age groups and between genders. And there's a very little difference between men and women when it comes to enthusiasm and playing games. So again, another one of those stereotypes that I think marketers would do very well to challenge if they're looking at their plans. This is a great opportunity. Games are universally popular and they represent a fantastic opportunity because it's a really immersive environment. Now, how your brand taps into that is an important question. It's not like you want to be interrupting gameplay with an ad to tell people about shampoo. That's not going to be welcome. But you've got great opportunities, all sorts of different ways that you can engage people, whether it's through the game itself, increasingly through people watching other people playing games. And that is, again, not restricted to those younger groups. It's the biggest audience, but live streaming of games, esports tournaments, they're big, big opportunities for marketers everywhere. So that was the second surprise. And again, I'll pause there.
And I think just aligned to that, I'm lucky enough to do training for Google, and we adopt the See, Think, Do, Care framework. And the point you nailed there, which I think is really important for people, is like, don't disrupt people when they're doing something. So, you know, the popping up of the ad is more disruptive than ever, and people are in that mode of intent. So think about how you can sort of curate your content around that, or what's appropriate to be shared that wouldn't frustrate that person. So whether it is, you know, live streaming and then during an ad break that you then invest in ads, or whether it is you create your own game. You know, if you find out that a lot of your users are interested in this sort of game like Sudoku or something, how can you create gamification around that? And I know a lot of sort of parent brands, mum brands have done a lot of gamification around that because again, not trying to be, you know, centric to females, but when they've got young children, you know, they want a bit of a distraction, they want some downtime. And obviously, again, a lot of us have sort of had the restriction of limiting things being able to do. So we do perhaps turn to our phones more, whether it's social media or gaming. So thinking about how you can use that space to engage with your target audience. So again, yeah, some fascinating insights. And I know when I work for Google, we're keen people to say, like, don't assume the data, and the gaming thing around males, females is a big data share that we always share with them and say, look, it's not just men, it is females as well, and it is the older generation. Don't make those assumptions.
Definitely. I think that's true of almost every aspect, but I think particularly when it comes to stereotypes. So where there is a commonly held belief, that's always the first thing to challenge. If you sort of go in just sort of assuming that you may see one or two things, but it's not a commonly held view, you know, you want to check that as well. But the more something is received wisdom, the more important it is to check it, because the more likely it is that it's either out of date or there's some nuance in there that will help you identify new opportunities. So whenever you can, check the data. I mean, I'm obviously biased. I have a massive interest in the data itself, but even for my own marketing, I constantly find that I've made mistakes by making assumptions.
But I think the fact that we now have access to data is hugely powerful. And I think almost people can get bombarded with too much data. I've been working in digital marketing since 2001. And I was working for a mortgage company, and they were just advertising in the newspaper, and it was based on sort of A/B demographics, that type of insight. And it was sort of, yeah, they're going to read it, but you don't know who's actually read it. So the data was there, but it's very limited, where now we've got so much data, it can overwhelm people. But the fact that you have it, go in with a question and think, I always say this with Google Analytics, and probably the same with your report, is don't go in and see what types of insight you can find. Go in with a problem, and then go in with a problem or a question, and you'll come out with an answer. Don't go in trying to see what you can find, because you'll be in there for a month of Sundays and probably come out with 101 questions.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. So the fetishization of big data, this obsession with we're data squirrels. Like we love to collect all these things and then bury them and never actually do anything with them. And that makes me very nervous. I think, you know, a lot of marketers will come to us with questions about whether they should use this tool or whether they should subscribe to this thing. And it's like, what are you hoping to get out of it? What are the questions or challenges that you're trying to address? And a lot of the time they just look at you blankly and they're like, these things aren't magic. You know, by buying them, I'm not going to suddenly have all the answers. And it's like, oh, I think you probably find that you're going to need a new person in your team just to manage a lot of that stuff. So I'm guilty of this. Like I said, I include new stuff in the report every year as well. So even we are guilty of contributing to that excess of data. But at the same time, I think there's a difference between big data and big insights. And if you have very, very small amounts of data, you can still make some really important decisions based on that. So go in with the questions. I think there's nothing wrong in going in and looking at reports, whether they're from us or from anybody else, with an open mind and having inspiration. But the more you know the kinds of challenges you want to overcome, the more effectively you're going to be able to use that data, and the less amount of time you're going to waste getting distracted by things that are interesting but aren't going to solve your specific problems. It's a little bit the same as buying tools. We love to buy these new tools without really knowing what we're using them for. So yeah, there's danger there. I think try and be focused. Set aside some time for inspirational stuff too, but especially where you're making investments, focus on the top sort of 10%, because that's going to be 80% of your value a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I think just to add to that, we get the same question all the time as well, like, what tools should we be using? And I'm like, what are you trying to achieve? Because you can spend so much time reading stuff and looking for tools, not actually doing anything. It can easily eat into your time. And with everyone's time being more precious, just really focus on what's my problem, what can I do to overcome that challenge, data, tools, and crack on, as it were, trying to look for the next thing. Because there is no magic wand. We have to use humans, we have to use our own actions at the end of the day to fuel this engine, don't we? So
yeah, I think a bit of advice there for especially for the folks listening in, it's like when you go to the doctor, you don't walk into the doctor and say, how do I get better? You kind of, the first thing you do is say, I've got these symptoms, I've noticed these changes, something's not quite right, and this is generally what I think you need to know. A good doctor will then ask you more questions, and they'll guide you to tell them a bit more about other things that might be there that you'd not noticed. But as a marketer, you've got to do the same thing. You can't just walk into an agency partner or whoever it may be and say, tell me how to be better, because there's so many different ways that you could be better. And until the person that's trying to help you knows a bit more about the challenges that you face, they're going to really struggle to give you the advice. So as a marketer, please write down your symptoms, write down your challenges, or on a more positive note, imagine you go into the gym, tell the personal trainer which bits of your body you really want to be better, and they'll give you personalized counsel based on that. Don't just go in and say, how do I get better? Because it's too wishy-washy. Slap.
And I think they're both really good analogies. I always say LinkedIn's a bit like a gym membership. People always say, oh, LinkedIn ads is really expensive. And I'm like, well, it's like a gym membership. If you don't use it properly, it's going to be expensive. But if you use it really well, it can be really, really cost effective. And the same with a lot of, the things you've just said. It's working out what you want the outcome to be. Then you can work through it. You can't expect a tool or data to suddenly wave a magic wand and create results instantly. And just to summarize that before we move on, we're an agency, we got a lot of inquiries every single day where a company will say, okay, can you help us do better? And they want a quote without speaking to you, and we're like, well, no. Like the doctor analogy, like, how can I create a magic, I can have a look at your website, have a look at your data, but I want to speak to you, I want to ask you some questions. So it's a really good piece of advice for people to take away, whether they're looking to work with an agency or whether it's their remit in-house. Like if your CEO or your stakeholder has said, do better, like work out what better is, get some SMART goals around it, work out what real problem and success they are and what you are, and then you should all be on the same page going forward.
Definitely. So I promised you we were going to talk about TV streaming, but maybe we'll park that for a moment. We'll come back to tantalizing cliffhangers. If you want to dig into any of the stuff we've talked about so far, maybe take it in a slightly different direction first. Go ahead with your questions now, because I want to leave that one hanging so people stick around for the TV one.
Sure. Okay. So in terms of the pandemic side of things, how has the pandemic affected the data, do you think?
So in terms of how it's affected the data specifically, we've certainly seen some challenges in collecting fresh data for internet use, for example. So the numbers that we published around growth of internet users has unfortunately been somewhat limited, shall we say. We published annual growth in internet users of 7%, but I suspect it's much higher than that. And that's because internet user research relies on face-to-face interviews. So even if you wanted to do research using the phone, unfortunately, that would skew the results towards people who are more likely to use the internet, because if you have a phone, you have access to a device that allows you to connect to the internet. So you can only really do internet research face-to-face, and in many developing countries around the world, in fact, even in Europe, unfortunately, at the moment, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So that's severely limited the ability of especially governments to collect new data. So I suspect we'll see a significant correction in that data 18 months, 2 years from now, when organizations are finally able to get out, do their research, collect, analyze it, and then publish it. It takes a long time to get this data. I think if you're reading the report, well, I would encourage you to do that, obviously, but when you look at one of the very first charts is annual growth, and you'll notice that social media growth has been much faster than internet user growth. That's principally because of those challenges. It's a lot easier for us to get the social media user data because it comes direct from a platform, and they've got a commercial incentive to tell you exactly how many people are using these tools any given day. What's fascinating is that we did see this massive growth in social media users last year. So almost 500 million new users came into social media during 2020, which just blows my mind, considering that we're already at above 50% penetration of social media across the world's total population. The fact that we're still seeing those levels of growth, 13% year on year, I mean, that surprised me. I mean, I expected to see high growth, but I didn't expect it to be that big. So on both sides of that, the COVID has definitely encouraged a lot of us to embrace new digital behaviors. I would like to say it's encouraged more people to come online, but sadly, I don't have the new data to tell you that conclusively. But amongst those people who are already online, definitely new behaviors, whether it is the grocery shopping that we talked about, whether it's embracing new social platforms, which we've definitely seen. It's not just in terms of new to social. I think a lot of this has been an expansion of the portfolio of platforms that people use as well. So you mentioned earlier grandmothers on TikTok. I mean, that is a thing. A lot of, especially older people. So if you think about the older generations, they were particularly badly hit in terms of the fear of what COVID might do to them. So they couldn't go and see their grandchildren. And a lot of time, whether it's video calls, whether it's following their grandchildren on social media platforms, that was the only real way that they could get their regular dose of family time. So that was one of the big takeaways for me, is it's really changed those everyday behaviors. Loads more stuff in there, but let me pause it. Give you another question.
I think just aligned to that on the social media side, just from the insight that we have from the people that we speak to, it's definitely, we've seen an increased usership of business to business organizations who would have traditionally used, had events, had physical networking things, and obviously that all got parked in the last year. And even sort of early last year, we got more B2B organizations inquiring for upskilling or training. Okay, we've got a sales team. How can we upskill them in how to use LinkedIn to generate sales? And obviously we're then saying, okay, well, it's content marketing that you need to focus on because you can't just go on and sell. So there's lots of upskilling there. But even now, we're still getting lots of inquiries of businesses that say, well, even if things do go back to normal-ish, are people going to be comfortable going to events? So actually, we've actually seen that social media is a serious tool. Finally, after all these years, it's not just a consumer-centric platform, that they are now taking it seriously. So it's been fascinating with what we've seen of how our inquiries have changed from a retained point of view and a training point of view of, most of them are significant large companies, and smaller companies often think, oh, well, the big companies have got it all sorted. They don't often have it sorted. They're like a huge ship, they're not as agile as small companies to change. So they've probably had the biggest change in terms of they've not had guys working from home and getting laptops in place, internet, safety, security, GDPR, all of that upskilling thing, and then trying to change the direction of the ship very quickly from a B2B point of view, where if you're a smaller organization and you might just be, 10 people, yes, it would have been some struggles, of course, but actually you're a lot more agile. So to make and adapt and make those changes has been a lot quicker. But it's been fascinating from our point of view how I've probably seen on the social media side more B2B organizations reflecting on that. And then on the consumer side, we've done a lot more e-commerce training for, again, large organizations that people think e-commerce is all sorted by large like FMCG brands. But again, they don't, they're traditionally looked at physical retail stores, and they would take them of high importance and walk through the stores every week to check the shelves. And they were listing their products. I always say they list and leave them. So they literally list and leave them on Amazon, or list and leave them on a supermarket like Tesco's or Carrefour or Walmart. And they've suddenly realized, oh my goodness, you can't just list and leave your product. Even if you're the biggest brand in the world, you need to make sure it's optimized. You need to make sure there's good reviews or A+ content. And if you've got thousands of SKUs, you need to optimize that. So it's been a real shake-up in both aspects. But I found the B2B stuff, I guess, not surprising, because I guess I wasn't surprised when we got all the inquiries. But even now, I'm quite surprised that businesses a year later and now only looking to, oh goodness, these platforms are not going away. and how we're going to generate leads from what was the way we used to do it and how we do it now. So that's been a fascinating learning from us from that point of view.
Definitely, I would agree with you there. I think one of the big surprises for me in the latest B2B data is the ongoing importance of interpersonal communication when it comes to making decisions in the B2B buyer journey. So the data that I'm going to reference here was actually in our October report. GWI does a work survey on a sort of biannual basis, and the latest edition of that came out just as we were publishing our October report. So we managed to squeeze in some fascinating insights in there. Events are still one of the most important, in fact, the most important source of new brand discovery for a lot of B2B brands. So trade shows, these kinds of things, critically important. A lot of those have gone online. But nonetheless, I think it's the interpersonal opportunities to speak to a representative, to learn more about it on a one-to-one basis, much, much more important in a B2B world. How you translate that into a digital world, especially due to COVID, but I think, as you mentioned, it's going to endure well beyond the pandemic as well, because people have realized these tools do work. I think just understanding the interpersonal dynamics there. So social media, sure, you can have a company page, you can post your promotional activities, but empowering your workforce to have conversations with people through social media, whether that's on a platform like LinkedIn, or whether it's through messenger platforms like WhatsApp. Understanding how to do that effectively is a crucially important skill because of the importance of those references in the B2B buyer journey. I think even just understanding how to send effective links to a potential customer through a platform like WhatsApp, if that's pertinent to your business. So how do you track that? Ensuring that you've got your tracking codes included in the URL so that you know that people are receiving these things through dark social, much as I hate that term. Yeah. And seeing that there's a power to that. A lot of this sounds complicated, but in most cases, it's just the very basic things that you need to do to understand the role that these channels play in your business cycle, if you like, and just getting a bit smarter about tracking that can really help.
And I think with that B2B side, people buy from people, and we've worked with, some of the largest organizations in the world in the last 12 months, because like you've said, you can post on social as a large organization, as a company, but there's the Gartner B2B buying cycle. Generally people are buying, if they're buying software or technology or making big decisions, that's not an instant decision, and they're not going to go Googling, I want some software for this. They're going to, as a board member, they might have a problem and they might be not tech savvy. So they might go Googling, go, how do we make our team more efficient, or how can we automate things? That's when there's the opportunity for content. And then from a content point of view, they then might follow you on social. And then if you're bringing your people to life with, little video streams of hints and tips, or what does the latest report say? People go, oh yeah, I really aligned to her. She really gets me. I'm going to inquire. And I think it's been fascinating how organizations, and you touched on this earlier, empowering your team. Lots of the larger organizations have worked said, people have said, oh no, we're not allowed to post this, or we're not allowed to do this because the company won't like it. And it has sort of, we haven't challenged that too much, but we've said, because obviously you don't upset the company, but we have said, look, if you want to sell online and you want to maintain relationships and build relationships, people buy from people. So you can't keep your people behind the brand. The brand is almost like the supplementary thing. You need to bring you need to educate your team on what is useful online, and think about it from a customer perspective or potential customer perspective. Create that content in, it might be that you've created a white paper. How can you put your view on that? How can you do a little LinkedIn video? And then how can you link that on your website? So it might be that someone's looking for some automated, how can we make our company more automated and more efficient? Might land on a website page, link to the bottom. Oh, and this is the expert on LinkedIn. Click on her profile. Oh, there's a little video. She just covered it. That's interesting. I'm going to connect. And then it's, there's been huge success from the clients that we've worked with in doing it that way. But it has really sort of shaken them up and really opened their eyes to how powerful social media is when you do it in that sort of strategic approach. And the brand is almost like supplementary, rather than they've always traditionally led with, we're the biggest in the industry, or and people don't know half the services they offer anyway.
Exactly. For anybody that's listening in that is found themselves in a position where the company said to them that they're not allowed to do stuff on social, I find this fascinating. This has been something that I've been trying to get my head around for almost 10 years now. You allow your sales force to go out and represent your company face to face every day, where they can say whatever they like.
Absolutely.
Being able to track what they're saying on social media at least allows you to see when they've made a mistake and correct that. I mean, obviously, there is the potential for more people to see that, and they can screw up royally, and that becomes quite a visible thing. But you've got to trust your employees and your teams, and if you don't, then they shouldn't be on your team in the first place. So I think if you don't trust them to represent you in social media, you've got to ask whether you trust them to go out and do the field sales as well. I think that lands more on the overall level of empowerment and trust within a company than the social channels themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say the same thing, you let them talk on the telephone, so why can't you let them
Exactly.
post on social media? Why, it's just another channel at the end of the day. It's no different to telephone face to face. So it's, find it very fascinating. So I think there's been a lot of shake up around that, around the B2B, but for the good. There's a lot of organizations that had that light bulb moment and they've gone, wow, no, this is a really powerful tool. So it's been fascinating and exciting to see some of the clients that we've worked with on that.
Yeah, I don't think that those skills that people are developing now are going to go to waste once the pandemic ends either. Even once we get back to physical events, the ability to amplify all of that stuff through social media is going to be of benefit. It's going to be, an additional increment on top of all the other stuff that we're doing. So if you're worried that this is a short-term investment, you're going to be reassured when you see the results longer term. So I would suggest if you haven't already started, goodness, what's been keeping you, now's the time to definitely get involved and make sure you don't miss out.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. And linked to that, I guess it's useful now to talk about the international side of things. There's an assumption, rightly or wrongly, from our point of view, we've seen a lot more organizations actually now realizing, but again, sort of because of the pandemic, but also with what's happened in the last 12 months, that they're not just limited to selling in their own country. So we've seen a lot of, we've done international marketing for years anyway, but we've seen a lot more actual inquiries coming to us on the international side where companies are expanding overseas. How's that been reflecting in the data? Have you seen any more international sort of insights there that might be useful for people to look into?
So the data that we track doesn't necessarily tell us about the volume of sales that come from overseas. It's not something that we track in a huge amount of detail. But one study that we've been following for a few years now by a company, I think it's P-Pro. I don't know whether it's PPRO, but I'm going to call them P-Pro anyway. So they're a sort of a payments and e-commerce research group, and they provide a variety of solutions as well. But in the studies that they publish, it's very clear that cross-border e-commerce transactions, so people in, say, Denmark buying something from a company in Germany, for example, that is definitely on the increase. I think the internet has very few borders, except for one or two countries where there are still limitations on what you're allowed to do online. But for the most part, the shopping journey is going to be international by default. I will be reading reviews from people in different countries. I will see what's popular on the internet, not just what's popular where I am. Once I come to checkout, yes, I'll probably look for somebody that's going to get it to me quickly and that's going to be able to give me local customer service if that's relevant to that particular product. But increasingly, we are seeing people buying from right the way across the other side of the world. And I think, anybody that is able to sell online can consider these things. You've got tax considerations, you've got logistical considerations, and in some cases, you've got different data things that you need to be aware of. But get your head around those, and suddenly, you're looking at huge 4.66 billion people around the world using the internet, and 75% of those are shopping online every month. So you can easily do the maths on that. That's a huge potential audience. Not all of them are going to buy your product, obviously. But by opening it up beyond your borders, you've got incredible opportunities. I know that for your British listeners, things like Brexit are going to be a bit of an issue there, but online shopping, online opportunities are certainly one of the easiest ways to get around that. So I think if you've been primarily focused on a domestic audience, now is a very, very good time to think about how can I expand this? There are lots of platforms out there that can help make that shift to an international audience if that's something you're interested in looking at. So you don't need to do a lot of the work yourself. You may need a little bit of investment, but it's really not as difficult as it seems for most people.
No, and I think just to complement what you've kindly shared is the cultural side of things. The biggest difference is the cultural side of things and how people purchase. So just as a very basic example, in the UK, we are very confident and happy to, go to a website, purchase something online, pay up front, where in countries like Saudi, they would go online and buy online, but they wouldn't expect to pay until it's delivered. So, and they would probably pay cash. So don't assume that people are using the same search engine as what they're using in their own country, or they're willing to make the same commitments online, or the review levels. So for example, in the UK, we might be happy with generally a 4.5, where in the Nordics, they're real sticklers for detail. And also linked to that, think about why people are purchasing things. And again, linked to the cultural side of things that I know you're really passionate about as well, Simon. So as an example, again, in the Nordics, they're often very keen to purchase things based on, good quality, how good quality, how efficient is it? Is it the best in its industry? Where in the UK, we're a stickler for price. So the messaging you need to have if you are doing international marketing is not just, I can market in Sweden or I can market in UK, taking account of all of those. But like you said, the borders are pretty much gone. They were never there in the first place, but it's sort of been people's own limiting borders. But again, I think because of people assuming that more people are online, even though you've obviously quashed that assumption, people are buying wider categories, which obviously is really important. So they are willing to spend, we're buying cars. I mean, I bought a car online years ago, but more people are buying cars online now. We're doing virtual walkthroughs when we're buying houses or renting houses. The categories have expanded hugely. And also another thing that's expanded hugely is the subscription model. I don't think you have any data in the report on that, Simon, but
frustratingly not,
no, but subscriptions have grown hugely. And I think that's because of a convenience side of things of, I've got 2 big dogs and I buy this massive bag every 2 weeks. And I'm like, why do I keep going down to the store to buy that? Well, I can get it on auto subscription. And I think people have also realized through COVID, this is my assumption, obviously not Simon's amazing data, is people have realized like what's important to them and what isn't. And some of us like to go shopping. I will go back to physically buying things because I like to touch it, feel it, and I've really missed that. But we've also realized that why are we buying certain things every week when we can just get it on subscription? So taking the pain points away to make our lives more enjoyable where possible.
Definitely. Going back to what you were saying about the cultural things, a couple of bits that did surprise me in the cross-border e-commerce data. Payment choices, so how people want to pay for things. You mentioned the difference in UK versus Saudi, but even within countries in Europe, the choices to whether or not to use credit cards varies dramatically. So Germany, for example, has quite different preferences compared to Italy or France in terms of how they want to pay for things online. Don't discount that. It's really important because the number of people that abandon when they get to the cart is that last minute of, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this. And payment preferences are almost always one of the first considerations. Does it accept my preferred method? Do I have to enter too many details in order to get this? So definitely one of the ones to consider there. And then I think it's fascinating. What would convince you to check out with a particular retailer? One of the questions in the GWI survey, consistently the top question there is free shipping. So it's one of the things to really think carefully about, especially if you're looking at overseas options. Suddenly the shipping costs may increase dramatically. Where you have an option to show people straight away how much it will cost to ship to their location based on a very straightforward IP analysis, knowing that right up front is a really powerful converter. So recently I was buying a piece of quite sort of obscure tech, and I went onto a website in the US and it said, we see you're in Singapore, so this is the price. You don't pay tax because you're not based in the US. This is how much it will cost to ship to you, price to you today, this. And I was like, great, because I was gonna get through all of this thinking and then have to make that decision. They put that out up front, and I confess that was me. I was sold as like, good, I trust these people. I'm going to do it straight away. So I bought it straight up, and it was brilliant. The cost of shipping was a lot less than I expected, and I was a happy man. It wasn't free, but they made it very clear up front how much it was going to cost me. So I think, if you're planning to do this, those are the really simple things that you can do. A lot of people get excited about translating their website. Yes, that's important. But more than that, the basic things like how much is it going to cost me, make sure you've got that cracked.
Yeah, and that's again really fascinating. And actually I posted on LinkedIn this morning, there's the Baymard report, Institute report, just said around 10% of e-commerce websites don't have all their product description and e-commerce information readily up front. And the point you've just made is a very valid one. And I always say, look, wear your own shoes. What's the thing that frustrates you when you go buying things online? It's easy to set up an e-commerce website online. I could do one this morning if I wanted. That's the easy bit. The hard bit is then getting people to actually part with their money and actually go through that buying process. And the more you can think about what are the barriers that I can take away, what are the things that are going to help convince more people, they're the things you should be looking at. And that example you've given, Simon, is a fantastic one of, okay, well, we can't offer free shipping, but tell people up front, because then they're going to, okay, I'd have to work that out later. Yep, I'm still willing to purchase. Then your abandoned cart rate is going to be a lot less, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't waste a lot of time, trying to convince people and remarketing to them when the real challenge is that they just didn't know how much it was going to cost.
Yeah. So we've shared, well, I haven't shared, Simon has shared an amazing set of data today. I could talk to him for months. So thank you, Simon. But you had us on the end of our seats. There was one more bit of data you were going to share with us that I would like to ask now, if that's all right.
Yeah, so TV is consistently the sort of the big question in marketers' mind when it comes to TV versus digital. What's going on? Should we still do it? So very simple answer. The more channels that you can include in your mix, the more likely you are to succeed. Very clearly in GWI's data, if you want to raise awareness, you're looking for a broad and balanced marketing mix, and TV is still a very, very important part of that. But TV behaviors are changing quite significantly. So I think the more I look at it, the more this number surprises me. 70% of the world's internet users now stream TV content through the internet. So whether it's Netflix, Disney Plus, a local equivalent, 70%. It just blows my mind. I really did not expect it to be that high. But perhaps even more important, more than 40% of our total TV time is now taken up by streaming. And that's a global stat. That's not just the US or Europe. So that includes a lot of developing nations in there as well. The fact that so many people are watching these over-the-top services, and the fact that it accounts for so much of our time, has some really quite important implications for brands that are heavily dependent on TV, because sure enough, not all of those platforms are ad-free, but Netflix is by far the top choice around the world, and the majority of Netflix is completely ad-free. So if you were a marketer that has historically relied very heavily on TV, and that's then guided a lot of the other activities that you do in other channels, now is the time to start easing your way out of that. This is not a black and white choice. You don't suddenly have to stop doing things overnight and flip to a new model, but you want to ease off your dependency on TV, especially as it dictates what the rest of your channels look like, because you're not going to be able to have the same level of impact through TV, perhaps, that you did historically. I'm not saying TV is going to be less important, but the way we use it needs to change. So instead of it being 30-second interruptive ads, things like product placement are going to become much, much more important and compelling as opportunities. We're seeing Netflix develop an entire department around this, and quite rightly so. I think it's fascinating. So if you have been heavily dependent on 30-second TV spots, ask yourself, if I didn't have the option to do those anymore, but I still wanted to do TV, what would that look like? Where would I prioritize? And what would create the most value for my audience? Because as we talked about earlier, that interruption is the biggest frustration when it comes to advertising. When people are asked why they use ad blockers, it's because ads are crap, not because of privacy concerns. So, how do we move into a world where our TV content adds value, and then also how does the rest of our mix add value as well? But yeah, those numbers blew my mind, so I thought that it would definitely be worth sharing for the listeners today as well.
Absolutely, and I think it's just phenomenal. The data around that stat, really. I think about 70% of people are streaming online. But again, if you put your own shoes on and think, the listeners or the watchers today, like, do you stream? Yes, I'm streaming now more than ever, especially if you have children, because, God forbid, if we weren't allowed to stream Bob the Builder or, Fireman Sam or something, this house would just be a meltdown half of the time. And then it was funny because we've just moved house, and I'm getting a bit personal now, but it's funny because my son's 3 and we've literally just moved house, and he's used to streaming on Amazon Amazon mainly. And he had to watch regular telly the other day, and he was watching regular telly, and there was an advert, and he's like, "Mum, the telly's broken," because he was seeing an advert, and he's like, "It's broken." I was like, "No, it's not broken. It's an advert. This is a 3-year-old." So, ads do generally disrupt, but in terms of the streaming, it's fascinating how, Netflix is ad-free. But if you don't mind, Simon, it would be really useful to just share the example you shared with me when we were chatting last week around, again, every country is different. So I think you're watching a soap in Japanese, was it? How they're doing ad placement now on streaming.
Yeah, I'm going to get the name of this wrong again. Izakaya Botakuri, I think, was the name of the show. It's entirely created by Kirin, which is a Japanese beer distillery brand. They've created this fascinating series of TV shows, which is based in effectively a pub in Japan, and customers come in, and it's like you said, it's a bit of a sitcom, it's a bit of a soap opera, I suppose, but baked into each one of those shows very overtly are recommendations of what to drink with each different kind of dish. So it's sort of a cross between sort of Bake Off and a bit of reality TV and all sorts of great stuff. I mean, the content itself it's not going to win an Oscar, but at the same time, it's compelling viewing. My wife and I both loved it. It's an entire series on Netflix, which is effectively an advertorial. And I think the first season was 10 episodes, half an hour each. I sat down and I watched, 5-6 hours worth of advertorial content willingly because it was well done. I think, not every brand's going to be able to do that. But at the same time, you've got these opportunities given the choice between creating a lot of interruptive TV ads and then spending a huge amount of money on media to put behind that, reverse that back out and said, if we created really compelling content that we then shared with a platform like Netflix, do we reduce the amount we need to spend on media and then invest it in creating amazing content? And as a result, have very different kinds of outcomes, but basically do a lot better stuff. So yeah, I mean, that blows my mind. It's not the only example I've seen, but it's the most recent one. So if you are looking at that new TV model, definitely look at creating your own TV shows too. It's not going to be cheap, but the outcome is definitely interesting.
And if you can get people binge watching, then it could, it's going to have a huge amount of impact and then brand recall. And hopefully, did you buy the beer more importantly? Because I know you're a bit of a whiskey drinker, but did you buy the beer?
So I'm already a big Kirin fan, but my wife particularly interests sake, and they did a lot of sake recommendations. And I confess we were writing stuff down and go, oh, we must try that one.
Yeah, so it really engaged with you, didn't it? It was engaged, resonated, and inspired you to buy other things. So it ticked all the boxes there.
And entertained me into the bargain.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insight and time today, Simon. I hope everyone who's listening or watching has found it fascinating. Do go and look Simon up on LinkedIn. Any other contact details or anything else you want to share today, Simon, that people can look you up for?
Yeah, so I'm guessing a few people will want to dig into the data for themselves as well. So the good news is we make all of these reports available completely for free. So 10 years worth of data across 240 different countries. You'll find all of that at datareportal.com. Not the easiest thing to say, but if you've got show notes, if you want to put a link in there, Lynsey, that'd be absolutely brilliant. But yeah, LinkedIn, the best way to contact me if you've got questions about that, or you can find me on Twitter as Eskimon.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much, Simon.